Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are pulling back the curtain on some of the greatest illusions ever recorded. We so often view the past as a series of solid, unshakable facts. But the truth is, so much of what we just blindly accept as history was actually a carefully constructed performance, a facade hiding a much more complex and sometimes truly bizarre reality. We're going to completely strip away the myths today. Okay, let's dive into this. Here's our roadmap for this explainer. First up, medieval mines. Second, the gilded noble prison. Third, secrets of the labyrinth. And finally, Nero, the performer tyrant. All right, section 1, medieval mines and myths, fluids, faith, and fouls. Imagine living in medieval Europe, where the extreme complexities of human mental health were completely masked by a really wild mix of supernatural assumptions, intense theology, and literal bodily fluids. Because they totally lacked the vocabulary for psychology, early medical science, specifically the humoral system pioneered by Hippocrates and Galen, tried to physically quantify emotions just to get some kind of control over the unknown. They believed your entire personality was dictated by 4 literal juices. So because of this, emotional distress wasn't treated with therapy, it was treated like a plumbing issue. If you had too much blood and were acting manic, a physician with a sharp knife and some leeches would literally try to drain the sad right out of you. If you were angry, well, they assumed you had an excess of yellow bile and immediately prescribed laxatives. This sheer desperation to map out the uncontrollable led to some absolutely bizarre diagnostics. Society basically blamed everything on external forces. Act strange around a full moon? You had lunacy, which came from a genuine widespread belief that moonlight actually scrambled your brain fluids. Hearing voices wasn't viewed as trauma, it was treated as a sort of demonic Airbnb situation in your soul. And for women, perfectly standard human emotions were often attributed to a wandering womb causing hysteria. But the cures? Oh man, the cures were just as wild. We're talking everything from eating powdered emeralds to literally tying a dead owl to your scalp, just hoping the bird of wisdom would somehow absorb your melancholy. No way, right? So if the dead owl didn't work, and let's be honest, it didn't, you really had 2 main avenues for care. First, you had the institutional power of the church, which largely viewed mental illness as a moral failing. The priest was your default doctor, offering minor or major exorcisms. These were essentially theatrical spiritual evictions complete with chanting and holy water. But then, operating in the shadows, you had the marginalized figures, the herbalists or the cunning folk. These were often elderly women operating totally outside the church's approval, offering tinctures, chamomile tea, and something genuinely revolutionary. They actually listened. The great irony here is that while the institutional power was performing useless theatrics, these unlicensed women were effectively inventing early modern talk therapy. A not theological approach could be profoundly damaging. Take the term acedia, for example. Today, if a monk was lying in bed, staring blankly at the ceiling, utterly unable to work, we'd immediately recognize it as severe depression or burnout. But medieval society classified acedia as a spiritual failure, a sinful lack of joy. Instead of offering compassion, they handed you the crushing weight of moral judgment and told you to repent for letting the darkness win. An actual medical condition was completely masked by guilt. Moving right along to section 2, the gilded noble prison, splendor and suffocation. Now, what's really interesting about this is how the idea of global nobility completely flips our modern understanding of privilege. From Versailles to Kyoto, the aristocracy projected this absolute illusion of divine perfection. Publicly, life was a nonstop spectacle of perfumed corridors and elaborate rituals. Think of the famous French levee, where courtiers would literally line up just to watch the king get out of bed. But the private reality behind those closed doors, it was a meticulously choreographed prison. To maintain this flawless illusion, nobles were absolutely crushed by debt. Families were mortgaging massive ancestral estates just to afford the waistcoats required to stay socially relevant. Over in Russia, incredibly wealthy-looking aristocrats were making desperate secret trips to the pawn shop. It was a flawless, dazzling performance of wealth that had profound existential dread. So when your entire life is a mandatory public performance, your only real freedom exists in the shadows. To survive this gilded cage, nobles developed some absolutely fascinating methods of subversion. They communicated using hidden ciphers and invisible ink just to bypass royal surveillance. In Japan's incredibly rigid Heian court, rebellion took the subtle form of poetry. A simple 31-syllable waka poem could convey a forbidden romance or a devastating, career-ending insult without ever technically breaking etiquette. And for a lot of exhausted aristocrats, the ultimate act of rebellion was simply feigning a severe illness. It gave them a socially acceptable excuse to finally escape the suffocating court and retreat to the quiet countryside. Okay, so we've seen how social systems and royalty can create these elaborate behavioral illusions. But what happens when an illusion is actually baked into the very stones of a physical structure? Let's travel to the ancient island of Crete to find out. Section 3. Secrets of the Labyrinth, the Palace of Knossos. Picture this. It's the year 1900, and a British archaeologist named Sir Arthur Evans starts excavating a massive ruin on Crete. He was obsessively chasing the legend of King Minos and the terrifying Minotaur trapped in a labyrinth. But what he actually found was the Palace of Knossos, the heart of the ancient Minoan civilization. And honestly, the reality of what the Minoans built is arguably way more stunning than the myth. This was a 150,000 square foot multi-story puzzle palace. They didn't have a half-bowl monster in the basement. They had advanced Bronze Age plumbing, including actual flushing toilets. Their art revealed a surprisingly egalitarian, perhaps even matriarchal society where priestesses held vast divine power. Plus, they communicated using Linear A, a script so incredibly complex that it remains entirely undeciphered to this day. The Minoans were truly incredible. But Arthur Evans? He wasn't satisfied with authentic, crumbling ruins. He wanted his labyrinth. So, in an unbelievable act of historical betrayal, he literally poured modern concrete over the ancient site. I mean, he painted concrete pillars bright red and essentially invented entirely new frescoes out of tiny shards of paint, completely reshaping the archaeology to fit his heavily romanticized Edwardian fantasy. He physically built the myth he wanted to find. And today, millions of visitors walk through those ruins, engaging with this strange hybrid mix of ancient reality and modern imagination. So, Evans rebuilt a palace to fit a myth, right? Creating an illusion born out of sheer archaeological arrogance. But the stakes get infinitely higher when the architect of the illusion is alive, profoundly paranoid, and commanding the deadliest military force on Earth. Which brings us to Section 4. Nero, the performer tyrant, a reign of theatrical terror. Let's step inside the mind of Emperor Nero for a second. Crowned at just 16 years old, he began his rule as a terrified teenage puppet, totally manipulated by his mother, Agrippina, who had ruthlessly poisoned her way to power, by the way. But as we know, absolute power rapidly corrupts. As Nero's paranoia escalated, the puppet violently severed his strings. By 59 CE, he orchestrated his own mother's assassination. Free from her control, his grip on reality just began to completely fracture. This peaked with the catastrophic Great Fire of Rome in 64 CE and finally ended in massive provincial rebellions that forced his suicide in 68 CE. You see, Nero's core driving force wasn't governance at all. It was the facade. He desperately wanted to be an artist, and he treated reality like a script he could just rewrite with fire and blood. He forced Roman senators to sit through agonizingly long hours of his singing. He competed in the Greek Olympics, literally fell out of his 10-horse chariot, and still demanded the first-place prize. When Rome burned, he seized the scorched earth to construct the Golden House, a massive personal pleasure palace. And to deflect the rampant rumors that he started the fire himself, he stage-managed a horrific distraction, scapegoating a small new sect called Christians and subjecting them to theatrical, brutal executions. Reality was entirely bent to serve his performance. When the rebellions finally cornered him, Nero realized his absolute power was gone. He fled. But even in his final moments, his narcissistic delusion held incredibly strong. He didn't mourn for the Roman Empire. He felt absolutely no remorse for the blood on his hands. Right before taking his own life, his final words were, "What an artist dies in me." He saw himself entirely as a tragic performer who was simply losing his audience, completely blind to the monster he had actually become. From medieval doctors literally trying to measure the soul in bodily fluids, to exhausted aristocrats suffocating behind silk fans and perfumed rituals, from archaeologists pouring concrete over ancient mysteries just to tell a better story, to an emperor who burned his own city to the ground to build a grander stage, history is absolutely full of masks. Which leaves us with this final thought. When you look at the structures, the leaders, and the social rules around us today, how much of our own modern world is just a well-rehearsed performance? Keep questioning what you see. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and I'll catch you next time.